Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to today's Innovative Lives program. I'm Arthur Daemmrich, Director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. We're meeting today via Zoom, so a couple of quick notes. We encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A feature. Please do so at any point during the presentation. I'll convey them to our wonderful innovator today. Second, we are recording the program, but you, the attendees, will not appear on camera. No fear there. And third, if you have any technical problems, please submit those via the chat. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, our audience from across the United States and internationally, to this Innovative Lives program, and to our way of celebrating Washington, D.C. as a place of invention. The Lemelson Center has a tagline that says we want to educate, engage, and empower people to invent and innovate for the benefit of mankind. Our projects really range from research and documentation to exhibitions to hands-on invention education. For example, the lower level area adjacent to the cafeteria in the National Museum of American History currently has the exhibition Picturing Women Inventors, showing larger than life portraits of a dozen women who invented in areas ranging from computing to sports bras to laser surgery for cataracts. Our goal with a program like today's is to feature an amazing innovator, but also show that all of us can be inventive and participate in America's innovation system. Innovative Lives programs showcase innovators as people, exceptional people, but still very much human, approachable, accessible, and worthy of emulation. And as you'll see, we really couldn't do better than the program we have for you today. For this program today, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Dr. Martine Rothblatt. Her long list of accomplishments include creating and commercializing satellite radio, founding a life-saving biotechnology company, advances in electric flight, advocacy for transgender rights, work on the future of artificial intelligence and digital immortality, and sustainable building commitments. We may at the end ask her if retirement is even an option, but Martine, let's start at your beginnings if we can. So you were born in the mid-1950s and grew up in La Mesa, California. How did your family come to be there?
I believe first, very happy to be with you here today, and thank you for inviting me on the program. My family immigrated to the United States, landing first in Chicago. They immigrated from Odessa, Russia, or Ukraine, I guess I should say, and landed in Quebec and went by railroad to Chicago, and that's where they began. That was my grandparents' generation. And then my father, after serving in World War II, went on the GI Bill to obtain a college education and ultimately a dental degree from the University of Illinois. But I think when he was in the Army, they had briefly been based in San Diego, California. And he didn't really realize it was possible to have a 72-degree Fahrenheit temperature all year round, having lived in the Windy City for his entire life. So promptly upon receiving his dental degree, he moved his mother and their 6-month-old child, which was me, to the suburbs of San Diego, I think very much seeking a temperate climate.
Amazing. And so, tell us a bit about what you were like as a kid. What were your favorite toys? Did you take things apart?
Yes, I think I was a pretty much of a run-of-the-mill kid. I would say I was probably more of a bibliophile than the average kid. I read a lot. My favorite toys were building and assembling and then running slot car tracks. These are electric race tracks that you put these little tiny electric cars on, and they go into a slot, hence they were called slot cars. And based on your design, you can get them going very, very quickly, but you had to be careful in your design of the track so that they didn't go so fast that they went flying off the track on the curve. And I spent a lot of my time with that kind of electromechanical activity.
Yeah. Were you also one of the kids who, ran a lemonade stand? Were you trying to make money? Was there a budding business leader, or did that really come later?
That really came later. I did my best to complete my chores so I would get my weekly allowance.
Right, right. And did I read correctly that you were a drummer as a kid?
Yes, I am an amateur musician, so I played drums, keyboards, flute, and in one of my first bands was a rock and roll band. I played the drums, and we were pretty much a kind of a Creedence Clearwater Doors cover band. So we played mostly those songs, and I was the drummer for them. My neighbors were not too pleased because even though my drum set was in the garage, it was a bit loud, and they were not really that happy when I was practicing.
I bet. No, that's a common theme among drummers. Everyone I've known has had that experience. Were there any kind of outside of the family and any mentors that kind of stand out in your memory who influenced you as a young person, maybe in high school?
That's really a great question. And in high school, I can't think of really any great living mentor, face-to-face kind of mentor. However, as a bibliophile, I was obsessed with reading biographies of people. And these individuals who, going back in time, who invented amazing things and innovated in astonishing ways, these people leapt off the pages of the book and became, more real to me and more inspirational to me and more mentoring to me than anybody that I really knew, flesh embodied. So individuals like Edison and Nikola Tesla, who just, persistently tried to do what people thought was impossible. Madame Curie, winning 2 Nobel Prizes and coming up with extraordinary discoveries that let the invisible world become visible to us in a way that's so useful. It was the subject of the biographies, the subjects of the biographies who became my mentors. And I think I became their mentee, and that I would ask myself, what would Amelia Earhart do at this point in time? What would George Westinghouse do at this point in time? And I have tried to pattern myself after these people about whom great biographies have been written.
That's beautiful. That's really fascinating. And then for college, I gather you went to UCLA for a couple of years, but then had quite a remarkable backpacking and trekking adventure. Can you share a bit about that and how that shaped your life?
Yes, I did leave college after a couple of years because, I wasn't really sure why I was there. It was a normal thing to finish high school and go to college. But my major was called undeclared, which is a very open and honest way of saying you really don't know why you're there. And, I happened to read about an island chain in the Indian Ocean called the Seychelles Islands. I read about it in a weekly magazine called Newsweek, similar to Time magazine. And they had a spread in this magazine where they said, in this, world that sometimes seems to be going to hell in a handbasket, there is one idyllic, beautiful place in the world, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, far from all the major world powers who are in conflict with each other. And the people have such a good life. that they can catch all the fish that they need in the sea. They drink fresh coconut milk from the coconuts. And I thought to myself, wow, this sounds like a utopia on Earth. I could learn more by going there and enjoying that than another macroeconomics class at UCLA. So I had saved up a little bit of money from my working, and I bought a ticket to Amsterdam, and then I bought a used VW bus there and drove that down to Istanbul, Turkey, sleeping in the bus while I was to save money. I then sold the bus to some Pakistani gypsies who were visiting Istanbul. And with that money, flew down ultimately to Kenya, and then from Kenya over to the Seychelles Islands. Once I was there, I was pretty much out of money, but fortunately, I ran into some other musicians, and they needed a keyboardist for their band, which played at hotels on the islands. So I was able to support myself as a musician in the Seychelles.
And this was, this was sort of 1978, 79 in that time frame?
Exactly. And it was a time that there was a lot of concern about what was called like the Watergate era and about corruption in government. There was worry about the Cold War between Russia and the United States. There was worry about, China having nuclear weapons. There were millions of people on the verge of starvation. So it was, and last but not least, we were coughing in pollution, from all of the car exhaust. So the magnetic attraction of this beautiful place in the middle of the Indian Ocean was irresistible to my nature as a person who wants to really live an enjoyable life and help others to live an enjoyable life.
So why are we speaking here today? Why are you not still in the Seychelles playing keyboards?
It's funny. I had several somewhat rude awakenings there, but also a beautiful epiphany. So my finances were meager. I could not afford a hotel room. So I was able to rent a concrete block hut to stay in that had openings for windows, but no actual windows, and a dirt floor. And it just had like one bare light bulb. And every night, the room, I guess you could call it, was if the light was on, there were literally hordes of moths. It was like locusts that would come attracted to this light. And I really couldn't sleep because I kept it was too light with the light. And then when you turned off the light to get rid of the moths, right away there were hundreds of giant cockroaches that came out of I don't know where. And having grown up in a middle class home in suburban San Diego, my brain was just not wired for living with hordes of moths and crowds of cockroaches. Secondly, the other members of my band were living in poverty, and in fact, the article in Newsweek was pretty much a complete lie. Because the people were living in mud, and they were very poor, eating minimal amounts of food. And the place was basically colonized by South African hotels, where wealthy South African people, or maybe Europeans, were living high on the hog. And the whole place actually seemed not utopic, but in fact dystopic. So that was a rude awakening. But one of my bandmates, he invited me to come see the NASA tracking station at the very top of the island. The main island there is called Victoria Island, and the main city is called Mahe. And I could see from the bottom that there was something up there, but I didn't really know what was up there. So he borrowed a friend's car, and we drove round and round till we got to the top. And there was this gigantic radome, in other words, like a kind of a dome over a giant satellite dish. We knocked on the door, and inside it was just like walking into the future, going from the mud, to like the inside of a high-tech spaceship. And I think my brain had like a kind of a future shock experience. And there was an engineer who very calmly explained to us what was being done at this NASA tracking station. And to my amazement, they were tracking the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft out to Jupiter and Saturn. And this NASA facility was part of the Deep Space Tracking Network. And I engaged in a long discussion with the engineer. And I asked him, would it be possible for these satellites and space probes that he was communicating with to communicate with regular people? And he said, well, it would be possible, but they would have to be very, very powerful. And he explained to me that the probes were so small they could fit on a desktop. And that's why the tracking station had to be as big as a house. But he said if the satellites could be as big as a house, then the tracking apparatus could fit on a desktop or even smaller. And that became an epiphany to me. I said, wow, maybe there is some way that I can build satellites as big as a house so that millions of people can be communicating with things in space, instead of just a few isolated people communicating with things in space. So we went back down, and I made a beeline all the way from the Seychelles to Kenya to Paris to Los Angeles, re-enrolled in UCLA with a degree in telecommunications studies, a specialization in satellite communications. And from that point, through all of my career in satellite communications, I was obsessed on designing, building, launching, and operating larger and larger satellites so that ever more people could be in direct communication with each other.
That's amazing. I mean, to just seize that and run with it. And so you then continued on at UCLA for an MBA degree and a JD, which, did you do those jointly?
Yes, fortunately, UCLA had a joint JD MBA program. And if you were accepted to either the law school or the business school, you could then apply to be accepted to the other of those two. And if you were accepted, they crammed 5 years of combined law and MBA, 3 years of law, 2 years of MBA. They crammed that into 4 years of a much more intensive program. And we had a little club. We called ourselves the Executive Barristers. There were only about 15 of us out of several hundred students in the law and MBA school. But, I saw that law was like one side of a coin. Law was like heads and business was like tails. And I saw that from my very first classes in law school. When you go to law school, the very first class they require you to take, in fact, I would say it is the iconic law school class, is called contracts. And because really going back to the earliest stages of human civilization, the first thing that, once people had any kind of language, and perhaps even before language, they would make an agreement with each other. And in fact, a contract is nothing more or less really than a meeting of the minds. So it's really something very magical and cognitive. I love it. How two minds stuck in two different scalps can actually reach agreement with each other is amazing, So I actually got the highest grade in my contracts class. They gave me an Amateur Award in contracts, but I saw that all the contracts really were about business things. I mean, that's what all the contracts were. So I thought I could be much more useful in building and launching satellites if I got a business degree as well as a law degree. And so I did.
Yeah. So, I mean, you graduated in 1981, if I have it right, and it's kind of an interesting historic moment because, of course, the AT&T breakup was maybe on the horizon, but hadn't really happened yet. And generally, telecommunications in the U.S. and even more so, in Europe and a lot of other parts of the world was primarily kind of monopoly driven still. And so I'm just curious, what was your view at the time? Did you anticipate business opportunities here when everyone else was kind of stuck in a more of a monopoly state-provided framework?
Well, you are right that was the time frame of monopolies, but also at that time, that was the same time frame that the Federal Communications Commission had embarked on a revolutionary, what they called an inquiry. It's a method for the Federal Communications Commission to set forth a policy proposal and to get reactions to that policy proposal from people throughout the country. And the name of that inquiry was the Computer Communications Inquiry. Mm-hmm. And that was the very beginnings of the FCC saying that in the future, most communications are going to be digital and are going to be indistinguishable from computer communications. Now, that was a radical notion at that point in time. And at that point in time, I would say about less than 5% of all things that were transmitted over wires or even wirelessly were transmitted as digital code, and the rest was analog voice and analog video. Today, it's the reciprocal. More than 95% of everything is transmitted as digital code. So the Federal Communications Commission was, really on top of the breaking technology. And they said that while monopolies might be an appropriate structure because of the enormous investment that was necessary for an analog communication system, once you went to a digital communication system and hundreds, if not thousands of sources could generate digital information, and in fact, all that digital information would be multiplexed as combined signals, the monopoly structure no longer made any sense. And so the FCC was proposing at that time that the future would be competitive because of the technological breakthrough of computer communication.
Right. Now, the FCC saying that and the private market recognizing and acting on it aren't always the same thing. So tell us about, I understand you briefly were at Burlington Coving, doing lobbying work, but then fairly quickly came to work at GeoStar. So for the younger people here, what the heck was GeoStar? And then what were you doing there?
Sure. So when I graduated from law and business school, the nice thing about going to a place like UCLA is that a lot of employers come to the college themselves and they recruit you, which was a pleasant experience because the whole previous part of my life, it was like going to a restaurant and asking for an application, to be a busboy or something like that. So it was very nice to have these employers come. And amongst the law students, there was a sentiment that you should try to get a job with the best possible law firm that you could, because if you did not get that job right out of law school, you were unlikely to get it later. And so there was the number one law firm in Washington, D.C. was called Covington and Burling. Today it is just called Covington. but back then it was called Covington and Burling. And they had a reputation of, many of their lawyers were, secretaries of state and secretaries of commerce and Supreme Court judges and you name it. So they interviewed me and they said, well, this is very interesting. You've published 5 articles on satellite communications and you've not even graduated yet. You must be obsessed with this field. And I said I was. I said that I'm trying to be, the best expert I can possibly be on satellite communications. So they said, well, we represent the association of all of the nation's broadcasters. You may have heard of the National Association of Broadcasters, and I had. And they said, we have a lot of satellite communications work for you to do. So I felt that, wow, this was kind of like 2 birds with 1 stone, the top law firm in Washington. So my career was on a good track, and one that had a specialty in what was still a pretty niche area of satellite communications. So I accepted the job. Little did I know that I was the only person that they had hired from UCLA from the past several years. And when I got to Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C., more than one partner asked me where my beach towel was. But I did miss the body surfing because I did grow up body surfing the waves there in Santa Monica. But in any event.
So you picked up the right suit and you made sure to get the right black shoes to blend in with the crowd.
As best I could. And however, once again, I had both a rude awakening and an epiphany. And this may be kind of like, a story of my life. But the rude awakening was that they said my job was to do everything I could to block the approval of any satellite communication systems, because these represented a competitive threat to the companies that were still using VHF and UHF frequencies to broadcast over the air television channels. And, I knew I could not say that that goes against my beliefs, because I did believe very much in the beneficent applications of satellites. Because another thing they teach you very much in law school, and they really grind into your head, is as a lawyer, you're supposed to be an advocate, and you're not supposed to substitute your point of view. If you think the guy is innocent or guilty, if they're your client, you have to represent them zealously. And so I knew I had to be a zealous advocate for the National Association of Broadcasters. But it left a bad taste in my mouth. And I did the best I could to come up with reasons why these satellite systems should be delayed. They could cause harmful radio interference to the VHF and and UHF waves and whatnot. But the epiphany that I had was that they were working me so many hours, like 16 hours a day. They were paying me, a fixed salary, which my per hour salary was going down with the number of hours I worked. And because I had to fill out billing sheets to the clients, I knew that I was being charged for my time a very high multiple of what I myself was getting paid. And they were very kind to send me to conferences about satellite communications and radio communications. And when I went to these conferences and I talked to business people there, they said, Martine, you know so much about this field. We would like to hire you directly. So then I thought, well, maybe I should just set up my own consultancy and maybe earn a little bit more money and be able to help directly satellite communications companies rather than undermining them. At the same time, along with my lifelong avocational interest in music, I also have a lifelong avocational interest in astronomy. You probably could see that from what I said about being fascinated by the Pioneer and Voyager missions to Jupiter and Saturn and beyond. So I thought if I didn't have to go to an office every day from 9 to 9, I would be able to represent clients out of my apartment or rent some small office, and I could study, take advanced courses in astronomy at the University of Maryland. And so I did that as well and enrolled in the graduate astronomy program at University of Maryland. And very soon I had several satellite communications clients whom were paying me very, very generously in order to gain approval for them at the Federal Communications Commission.
Right, fabulous. And somewhere in there, this is now the time period we begin to develop this idea for satellite radio.
Yes.
And so, I mean, tell us a bit about, it's different to track a space probe than it is to have radio waves going back and forth, although I guess we do use radio waves to communicate with long distance satellites. So just tell us about, developing this idea and then getting SiriusXM founded.
Yes. So in my quest to really know everything there was to know about satellite communications, which was really born out of my absolute passion for satellite communications. My passion for satellite communications was born out of my amazement that we could put things, a good portion of the way to the moon, literally a sixth of the way from the Earth to the moon, and be able to communicate with them. And of course, we could put things even further, as mentioned before, Jupiter, Saturn, and beyond, and communicate back and forth. It seems like magic. Like, how does that work? So my brain just went into overdrive in understanding all of the physics about how that worked. In the process of doing it, I quickly realized, as anybody would, that the only way that different satellite systems can operate at the same time is if they use different frequency bands. If they use the same frequency band, they cause mutually destructive interference and nobody can hear the signal. So I set myself to memorizing the entire radio frequency spectrum from the very low range of kilohertz all the way up to the very high range of gigahertz. And from the what are called kind of the shortwave spectrum down around the kilohertz and megahertz range to what's called the microwave and millimeter wave spectrum, all the way up around the megahertz and the gigahertz range. And it turned out that the government and in fact governments throughout the world had divided up the radio frequency spectrum by mutual agreement in international laws. Since really shortly after Marconi first demonstrated wireless communication. So of course, this also interested me as a lawyer. And it turns out that the International Telecommunication Union, which does this divvying up of all the radio frequencies, is the oldest international organization. And in fact, it started as the International Telegraph Union, because all the way back in the mid-19th century, France built a telegraph system that went to its border. Germany built a telegraph system that went to its border. They were on incompatible standards, and somebody had to decode the French standard and re-encode it for the German standard. They soon realized this was ridiculous, and they agreed on a common standard. And this was the beginnings of the International Telegraph Union. Then when Marconi came along at the turn of the 20th century, this evolved into the International Telecommunications Union. So they divide up the whole radio frequency into literally hundreds of little segments that are reserved. Some are reserved for ship to ship. Some are reserved for airplanes. Some are reserved for weather satellites. Some are reserved for television broadcasting, for cellular phones, you name it. Everything's got its reservation. One of my favorite ones is that there are certain sections that are reserved for radio astronomers to search for radio signals deep in space, because if everybody was like shouting at different frequencies at every single frequency, then the radio astronomers would have no frequencies left to search for radio signals. And I'm not saying necessarily it's ET, it could just be natural phenomena that are transmitted on radio signals. So I became an expert in all of these different areas. And as a result of that expertise, I began to realize that there were frequency bands that were ideal for passing through the atmosphere. And for some frequency bands ideal for passing through foliage, like tree leaves and things like that. So you combine that with what I mentioned earlier, that the bigger the satellite, the smaller the dish. I mean, there's more to it just than that, but to a first approximation, the more powerful the satellite, the simpler the dish. So then, of course, my mind, is going to be working and saying, well, how big would the satellite have to be for the dish to be so small that it could fit into the top of a car and you wouldn't even see it? You just drive around and you'd be able to be communicating with a satellite, and you could tune to the same station no matter how far you drove. So I did the math, I did the calculation, and I showed that, the satellite would have to be big and powerful. It would have to have kilowatts of power. And that meant that the solar panels on the satellite would have to be so big, they would have to fold several times to fit inside of a rocket cone. So that got me interested in the evolving capabilities of rockets. And I found out that, rockets were rapidly advancing in power and capability and size, and that we were now on the cusp of rockets that were powerful enough and big enough that they could accommodate a satellite that was bigger than a house, that had kilowatts of power, that could send such a powerful radio signal that people could receive it on a flat little planar antenna embedded into the car. They wouldn't even see it. And then my MBA knowledge kicked in and said, wow, all these people who are paying for cable television and don't like listening to just the same old radio stations and have no real diversity of choice in their radio station, they would start to pay radio. And so I birthed the SiriusXM business plan and took it through the processes of FCC approval. And that's how it came to be.
So, this is a pretty radical business plan, because putting satellites that are the size of a house in space costs more than, a couple of bucks. So who was backing this? Did you go to venture capitalists, or how were you structuring the finance to make this possible?
Well, the first people I went to were the people that had backed an earlier satellite company of mine called Geostar. And as you mentioned, Geostar was one of the very first private satellite communications companies. And its business plan was to track the location of trucks as they were driving around. Because if you put two satellites in orbit and you send a signal from a truck or a car, the signal can triangulate against the two satellites in orbit, and a computer on the ground can calculate the approximate location of that truck. Up until this time, there was no way to know where the trucks were going. And truck drivers would frequently stop at what were called payphone booths and call in and say where they were located. So I had raised a modest amount of money for that satellite location system called the Geostar system, and it had been quite successful. So I went to the investors who invested in that. Now, that only required about $100 million of investment, because the satellite packages that I put up were not whole satellites. I cut a deal with a company called GTE Satellite to let me put a little package on their satellite, like a hitchhiker package. And that was much cheaper, so I could do the whole business for $100 million. It turned out that the satellites needed for satellite radio, by the time you build the satellites and you launch them, you were over $1 billion. And by the time you really got all of the talent you needed, you were over $2 billion. So fortunately, in business school, they teach you one thing, which I would say is more valuable than everything else they teach you in business school combined. And it's called discounted net present value. Okay. And all of business school, in my opinion, could pretty much be collapsed to discounted net present value. So what that means is they show you how, and this is what I did with SiriusXM. You say, well, I'm going to have to lay out $1 billion in year one and $1 billion in year two, and maybe even $1 billion in year three. So now I'm $3 billion in the hole. But once this is launched, millions of people will pay $100 a year to have this kind of satellite radio service. So if 1 million people pay for it, I'm getting 100 million a year. If 10 million people pay for it, I'm getting $1 billion a year. So let's say that like in year 4 and 5, I have to build up to that subscriber level. But by year 6 or 7, I'm getting $1 billion a year coming in. So what net present value teaches is that time is not all of the same value. Each year further in time is worth less and less. So the first $1 billion that you had to pay out to get the satellites rolling, that costs $1 billion because that's a time equals 0. But the next year's one, that's maybe worth 10% less because that's a year in the future. Who knows what will happen? So that's worth 900 million. The third year, 800 million. Now that also means that the money coming in, the $1 billion a year coming in year 6, 7, 8, that's not really worth $1 billion at the beginning. That may be worth only $500 million or 400 million. But that money is going to keep going on and on. These satellites last for 20 years. So within a period of time of roughly 10 or 11 years, you could show people that the net present value of the money coming in is much more than the money that had to go out. And that this whole project, once financed, has a positive net present value. And that's the pitch that I made to the people on Wall Street. And that's how SiriusXM got funded.
That's amazing, because if I understand it, it was kind of 12 years between starting the company and actually having the satellite radio fully up and running, and the big boost in subscribership that I guess happened once Howard Stern signed on in 2004. We have a question actually from an audience member that I think is really timely to this, which it's kind of a broad question, but just how do you keep going and bring people along as collaborators when you have a vision for innovation that others aren't yet able to see or understand? And so satellite radio, it sounds like you're able to convey it to Wall Street, but you had to talk to more than just Wall Street in building this company.
The truth of the matter is that probably 99 out of 100 people that I share these innovative ideas with, be it vehicle location or satellite radio, they don't get it. Okay. And I don't have really any magic ability of persuasion. I always try to be governed just by physics and facts. That's really what I believe in the most, are physics and facts. But there are a lot of people that say, well, the physics, say that we should be able to travel half the speed of light. If you keep accelerating something in a vacuum with no friction, it'll go faster and faster till it's half the speed of light. But we have no technology that can propel us that fast, so I'm not going to believe in it. And they'll say to me something like, well, I certainly agree with you that a satellite in orbit should be able to communicate with people driving on the ground. But how about when you're behind a building? The building's going to block the signal. What's your answer to that? And, I did have answers to all of these things. But as you give the answers to the objections, a lot of times people's eyelids begin to drop and they just, they think you're just making things up. So the key on being able to succeed with these satellite communications projects was not so much the persuasion as it was the persistence, because 99 out of 100 people would end up saying no. That sounds like a great idea. Maybe it'll happen in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I've got faster fish to fry, for my investment dollars. But if you are persistent, you will eventually get the one person who buys into your vision, who you have this mind meld with, going back to contracts, who the pattern of your neurons jives with the pattern of their neurons, and they get it. They see the vision, they see the facts, they see the physics. They realize that there are a lot of chances for things to go wrong, but they believe in the jockey, they believe in the entrepreneur. They say, look, Martine, it all makes sense. There's a lot of chances to fail, but you seem like you believe this so much and you're so adaptable and nimble that I believe you'll find your way to success.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So the 1990s, then also though, as the satellite radio is booming, really taking off, is also a period of tremendous challenge for you and your family. So I wonder if you could kind of reflect back on that and then how that becomes the origins of United Therapeutics.
Yes. So, once again, there was kind of like, in the 1990s, I really had, I would say, two rude awakenings. So now they were piling up. But also two epiphanies. So the good was also piling up. So the first rude awakening was that our youngest daughter became very ill. Her lips turned blue. She couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. We went to doctor after doctor, and they didn't know. They did tests. They didn't know what was wrong. Finally, she ended up at Children's National Medical Center on Michigan Avenue in Washington, D.C., with the head of pediatric cardiology, Dr. Roger Ruckman, and he diagnosed her with a fatal illness called, at that time, primary pulmonary hypertension. Today it's called pulmonary arterial hypertension. He said it afflicted only about 1 out of 100,000 people. So very, very few. He said he only had 2 other kids with it. They both died within 3 years. And he said that the only hope was a lung transplant, although it would not be easy to find one small enough for a 6-year-old girl. So that was a rude awakening. I mean, that had me in tears. Yeah. It had my wife and I just seeing black, like our lives are over. I mean, our youngest daughter's going to die. Oh my God. Nothing matters anymore. But from that rude awakening, I developed an epiphany that I could change this. There had to be a solution. There had to be some kind of medicine that could halt this disease. And so I just began turning all the passion that I had for satellite communications into pulmonary, physiology and pulmonary biochemistry, and reading obsessively every single thing that I could read, digesting all the articles I could digest, until finally, out of this massive research, there was a light that began to crystallize, that I found a medicine that had been tested for congestive heart failure by a giant pharmaceutical company, GlaxoSmithKline. And while it did not work in congested heart failure, they had charts in their article that showed it reduced the pressures in the lung and left the pressures in the rest of the body alone. And that's exactly the problem with pulmonary hypertension. The pressures in the lung become fatal, and you can't just give a person a regular blood pressure pill because the pressure in the rest of the body is normal. So the person will just collapse from low blood pressure. So I had an epiphany that I would go to this pharmaceutical company and I would explain to them with like a net present value that they should develop this medicine for people like my daughter. The other rude awakening and that occurred during the same time is that I had felt female my entire life, but I kept those feelings very much tightly bottled up within myself because I was afraid of being humiliated by the people around me. And I was afraid of not being able to pursue my passions in satellite communications because I was afraid that people would just basically think I was crazy, that I was somewhere between a drag queen freak or just a psychologically deranged individual. And I was frozen in fear, so I just kept these feelings bottled up in me. But in my mind, they weren't bottled up. In my mind, they began to take over more and more of my mind space. And I began to visualize myself as female, a larger and larger percentage of the time. I opened up to my wife, Bina, and I said to her, I would like to explore my female self, perhaps through cross-dressing. And I told her about these organizations that existed for transgendered people to explore their cross-gender selves, be it female to male or male to female, or just queer, non-binary in between. And she thought that was great. That sounded very interesting and fun. And soon our children had found our cross-dressing clothes. So the cat was kind of getting out of the bag. And so the rude awakening was that I was not able to bottle this up forever. I was going to get outed somehow or another if I wasn't just going to out myself. So I finally decided to out myself. And instead, it turned out to be an epiphany. While there were some people that wanted nothing to do with me, that ghosted me, and family members and some friends, the big majority of people were actually welcoming, hugging, accepting. And I found myself having a burst of creativity that went even far beyond what I'd done in satellite communications. And so I found that when I went to Glaxo Wellcome and I presented this business plan to them, now presenting myself as Martine, as a fully, female self as I could, that when they said, no, we don't agree with your net present value analysis, I realized, look, I don't have time to go to 99 other pharmaceutical companies. My daughter's going to die before I get to the 99th pharmaceutical company. I'm going to have to create a pharmaceutical company myself, even though I never took biology in college. I knew nothing about life sciences. This whole field has nothing to do with satellite communications, nothing really to do with law per se. I said, I'm going to do it myself as Martine. And I believe that by coming out of this prison of gender and expressing my authentic female self, I had the magic power, if you will, to ultimately develop a medicine for Genesis. And now, instead of a few thousand people dying from pulmonary hypertension, tens of thousands of people are living with pulmonary hypertension, including our daughter Genesis being in her 30s. And our pharmaceutical company is an icon for people throughout the country, of a company that's able to develop medicines for rare orphan diseases and save people's lives. So all of that I attribute to the epiphany, really, of just being true to my authentic gendered self.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, the additional layer to that, of course, is, people who study the business of pharmaceuticals have looked at the regulation of the FDA. It's probably the industry which has the highest barrier to entry of nearly any industry in our country. So if you're going to start a company from scratch, you don't tend to do pharmaceutical biotechnology. Now, that said, of course, starting in the 1980s, we did have these biotech companies start up, but most of them, right, were scientists at major universities who then got venture capital backing and managed to go public within a couple of years. And so how did you had a molecule that you had found. That doesn't mean you have the rights to it, so you had to purchase it. How did you get kind of the financial backing and the support system to create a biotech company when you couldn't wave around, a PhD in life sciences the way everyone else in the industry was doing it?
Yes. So there were a few things that kind of, I would say were lucky breaks that occurred along the way. So one of them was that the market had become ripe for SiriusXM to go public. And when it went public, I was able to sell a lot of my founder stock in that company and use that to start up the R&D expenses of the company now known as United Therapeutics. Another lucky break was that the individual who was in charge of research and development at Glaxo Wellcome, his name is Bob Bell. He told me on my third visit to him, when I had given up on Glaxo developing it, and I said to him, would you just sell me the molecule and I'll develop it? He said, Martine, pharmaceutical companies don't really like to get rid of their molecules, even the ones that are not being developed. He said, however, I will share with you in all candor, from when you last visited me till now, my sister, who lives in Nebraska, was diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension. Bob Bell, went to the CEO of Glaxo Wellcome and said, can we develop this molecule for pulmonary hypertension? My sister was just diagnosed with it. And the CEO said, Bob, I'm really sorry about your sister, but you're telling me there's only a few thousand people that have that disease. We've adopted a new policy at Glaxo that we will only go after illnesses that have $1 billion or more in revenue potential, what they call blockbusters. And he said, I'm very sorry, but we're not going to be able to do that. So he said, Martine, I will become your product champion to license this medicine to your new company. I wish you all the luck in the world. And he did. He successfully went around Glaxo Wellcome. He got more than 10 executives to sign off on selling me the molecule for a total of $25,000, plus an agreement to pay Glaxo 10% of any revenues that we ever made from that molecule. Now, it is astonishing to me. It's astonishing to Dr. Bell. It's astonishing to a lot of people that we have paid Glaxo Wellcome more than $1 billion in just the royalties. The molecule sells for more than $1 billion a year today. Like I said, tens of thousands of people have been benefited from this molecule. And when I look back at my career at United Therapeutics, one of the most precious moments in my entire career was at our 15th anniversary. We had what I called a quinceañera, a kind of a coming of age party at the 15th anniversary. And I invited one person from each of our 15 years who I felt were essential to our success, to this come up on stage and get like a little award and say something. And one of them was Dr. Bell, because he had been essential to our success. And when I invited him to come to this, I was afraid to ask him about his sister, because most people, they just died. And he said, Martine, would it be okay for my sister and her son to also attend? And I like really dropped to the floor and like, praise the Lord. I was so happy she was still alive. He said, she is on your medicine, and that has kept her alive. And so Dr. Bell, by helping me get the medicine, actually did help his sister. And so she came to the ceremony. Everybody was crying, and it was a beautiful event.
And I understand, you went from an original, the molecule was being given to patients through an infusion, to an inhalable version, and to even an oral pill version. Can you tell us, what work is involved in that? I just said that in one sentence. That makes it sound easy. It's the same molecule, but it takes quite a bit to go from an infusion to an inhaled version, right? What kind of laboratory work and testing?
It's very, very difficult because there is this concept in medicine called bioavailability, and this other fancy word called pharmacokinetics. But basically what it means is that, not all medicines get into the body in the same way. And no doubt, everybody has a friend or a relative who is an insulin-dependent diabetic. And certainly those people would just love to pop a pill, but insulin doesn't work that way. And they have to give themselves their injection in the vast majority of cases. So, yes, it is very, very difficult. And it's especially difficult with this type of molecule because it has a very short half-life of 45 minutes. So, you can't take a pill like every 45 minutes, ridiculous. But, the way we did this is my mantra as an inventor and an innovator is, and I am just vicious on this mantra, which is approve and then improve. Approve and then improve. So first we got the intravenous infusion approved. Then we immediately got to work on developing a way to breathe it via inhalation, because that would be easier. And my daughter vastly preferred that. Then once we got the inhaled version approved, then we immediately began working on a pill version. And each case, we subtly changed the molecule and what it's attached to so it can be delivered in different ways. And that's been my approach to satellite communications, pharmaceuticals. It's I love this quote. One of my guiding quotes is from, I believe it's from Voltaire, who said that, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And so many inventors, they have like this perfect conception in mind, and they never get there, because what happens is things change in time, and another technology overtakes them. The wiser inventor finds something that is good enough to solve an unmet problem, and then continually improves it. Yeah. I see there's a lot of questions being asked there.
No, that's a great point, and we try to focus on that a lot in how inventors work as a process. And so, so a lot of biotech companies make one molecule and build out on it, but United Therapeutics has actually expanded above and beyond that. So talk about that transition from kind of the single molecule company into the broader portfolio, going into basic research, building out the company. That's far beyond the kind of solving the one problem of your daughter to saying, we're tackling a whole host of other diseases. I do believe you have a focus continued on the rare disease, right?
Yes, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing. It reminds me of this quote from Nelson Mandela, where he says that, you should not shy away from your brilliance, from shining with all of your abilities. Because when you shine with all of your abilities, you inspire many people around you to also shine with their abilities. So as United Therapeutics began to be known for saving the life of our daughter, Genesis, articles were written and whatnot. There are, many parents throughout the country whose children were also diagnosed with fatal or very challenging medical conditions. And people began to say to themselves, if Martine and United Therapeutics did it, maybe we could do it as well. And indeed, I myself was very much inspired by the film Lorenzo's Oil, which is a true story of a father whose son contracted a deadly illness, and no pharmaceutical company was interested in it. And he ended up developing a kind of a naturopathic treatment for it, which unfortunately was too late for his son, but did help many other people. So I watched that movie, Lorenzo's Oil, and that gave me inspiration and hope. And then in turn, I gave, just from my direct knowledge, I know I've given dozens of other parents, and maybe many more that I don't know, hope to do a similar thing. So one of those parents had a child with a condition called a neuroblastoma, which is a horrible pediatric cancer. It only affects children, and it's basically pretty much uniformly fatal. And it turned out that this parent knew of a treatment that was being developed within a hospital for it, but the doctor had no way to develop it into a medicine, get the FDA approval, approve it, do the clinical trials, prove it works. Long story short, we took on that project for another class of people similar to my daughter. And to make a long story short, today we have FDA approval for our medicine called Unitoxin for the treatment of neuroblastoma. It saves the lives of half of the people, half of the children that it's given to. It's such a rare disease that only about 200 children a year are able to avail themselves of this medicine in the US. And we cure the cancer in 100 kids a year. So this has been on the market for now over 5 years. So hundreds of kids have been permanently cured of their cancer. It doesn't come back even 5 years later, really as a result of me just trying to save my own daughter from a completely different illness.
That's amazing. That's really wonderful. And of course, you had this amazing breakthrough this January around xenotransplantation and the xenoheart. And so I wonder if you could talk to us. I mean, for people who didn't follow this in the audience, it's a pig heart that was genetically engineered to not cause the immediate rejection in a human, and quite successful. And I just want to quote from the son of the recipient. The recipient survived 2 full months beyond what they would have. And the son said, "We are grateful for every innovative moment, every crazy dream, every sleepless night that went into this historic effort." So tell us kind of the background story or the perspective from you of working on this initiative.
Yes, so you'll recall that at the beginning of my journey in the life sciences, I was told the only hope for our daughter was a transplant, but it really was no hope because there are so few lungs available that are so small for a little kid. Mm-hmm. So on a parallel track of developing medicines to arrest the progression of her disease, I also tried to figure out a way to solve the organ shortage problem. I did unfortunately have the experience of meeting some of her friends with this disease because there was like a parent support group. And there was one girl in particular who I will never forget. Her name was Kristen Gildea. She was about 10, 11 years old, a little bit older than my daughter. She has the same disease. Before I could get the medicine approved, the disease had totally ravaged her, and she did get a lung transplant, but it didn't work for her. And so she had to wait to get a second lung transplant, which never came. She played piano so beautifully that, of course, as a musician, that's going to touch my soul. And unfortunately, Kristen Gildea passed away. And I have really dedicated myself very much to creating an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. So no more Kristen Gildeas have to pass away. So that my daughter, should our medicine ever stop working for her, that she would not face the lottery of transplantation. I have met many people who are awaiting kidney transplants, heart transplants, liver transplants. And for all of these people, there is a very cruel logic right now that somebody has to die for somebody else to live. And I think that that was good for the previous generation as an approve. And now it's the time for my generation to improve on that. So I have developed a major project within United Therapeutics to create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. And we're doing that in two different ways. One way is to genetically modify the pig so that its organs will not be rejected when they're put into people. The reason for the pig is because by a fluke of nature, even though our last ancestor, common in humans and pigs, was 100 million years ago, there were dinosaurs at that time, that their organs are the same shape and size as human organs, and they function the same. So they're an ideal source of organs. They also have large litters, and we are expert in raising them. Americans eat 100 million pigs a year. And if we had an organ for everybody in America who needed one, that would use up less than 500,000 pigs, so less than half of 1%. So it's very practical. Again, I'm like a physics and facts kind of person, so it's very practical. The other thing that makes it practical is we live in the age post the sequencing of the human genome, and now we have sequenced the genomes of countless other animals and plants. We have the CRISPR-Cas9 technology to edit the genes. So it's very practical, factual, physical, to be able to modify the genes of the pig that give rise to rejection so that those pig organs will not. And we proved that earlier this year with Mr. Bennett Sr., the recipient of the heart transplant. And we are now preparing to build upon that 2-month success with clinical trials that will show, multi-year success, so we can create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs that way. That's called Xenotransplantation, with the XENO, meaning from a genetically modified pig. But we have a parallel track, which is to create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs using 3D bioprinting technology, where we 3D bioprint a scaffold of an organ. Every organ has a shape, okay? And we can print that shape with 3D printing technology. And we could do that with a material that is bioabsorbable by the body. Once we print it, we could then paint that scaffold with cells that are appropriate to the organ. So lung cells for the lung, hepatocytes for the liver, cardiomyocytes for the heart, and so on. And then nurture that cellularized scaffold in a bioreactor outside the body until it's fully functional and everybody has done their quality assurance and quality control checks on it, and then transplant that into a patient. Finally, we can even do that with cells derived from the ultimate patient due to the technology of inducible pluripotent stem cells, where we can take a differentiated cell, turn it into a stem cell, and then turn it back into specific lineages of cells so that that organ recipient would not have to take any immunosuppression at all. They would have literally grown their own replacement organ outside of their body. So this is the project that the same passion I had for the medicines to save my daughter and others, and the satellites to connect the world. Now that's front and center on the Martine passion list.
That's amazing. So do you see the main obstacles to that as being, just biological and building the knowledge and the techniques, or do you see them also in sort of social and economic to be able to make this happen and work?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both. My opinion on the social and economic is that humans, us, we don't do very well when things are scarce. Scarcity tends to bring out some of the gnarlier aspects of human behavior. And, there was a time not that long ago, a few decades ago, when dialysis machines were very scarce. And as a result, in each city, committees were formed in terms of who could get dialysis and who could not. Well, if you could not get it, it meant you died. So these committees were who could live and who could die. And the committees tried to, develop objective criteria, but later on, the socioeconomic academicians who have studied this said the committees really were just picking people who look like themselves and belong to the same kind of country clubs and whatnot. I think we would all feel that's horrible. And, it's the antithesis of what we think of by, say, like diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. And so, so what happened, thank goodness, is Congress, the first procedure that they agreed for Medicare to fund completely was dialysis. And as a result, the number of dialysis machines skyrocketed because anybody who built one, the government would pay for it. And now there's dialysis for everyone, okay? There's no shortage of dialysis. And people are able to stay alive long enough on dialysis to, in the best case, get a kidney transplant, otherwise at least enjoy a few more years of good life. I would like them to be able to bridge to a xenotransplant or a 3D bioprinted kidney. And so everybody would be able to keep on having a nice life. But my point is that scarcity, socioeconomic scarcity, brings out the worst parts of human nature. And my solution to that is not to ration things more rationally, if that's not a non sequitur, but instead to create abundance, to use technology, to use innovation, to use invention, to use our ingenuity to create abundance. And that's my mission.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. There's two more things I want to ask you about, although time is going to get tight. But you just have so many things going. So you're also working on an electric helicopter. And if I understand this correctly, in a way, this has flipped the script because as opposed to directly working on it, you're basically an angel investor in a company in Burlington, Vermont. But tell us what potential you see in that and how that innovation is going.
Yes, well, we feel very strongly at United Therapeutics that every company, no matter what they are doing, needs to do as much as they can to help halt climate change. And so toward that end, in the Silver Spring, Maryland neighborhood that you and I share, we have the world's largest zero carbon footprint building at the corner of Colesville and Spring Street. And when you deliver organs, you have to fly them to different places because they only last for a few hours and then they spoil. Unlike our medicines, you can't put them on a shelf. You can't even put them in a freezer. They're going to spoil in a few hours. So they're always delivered by planes and helicopters. While planes and helicopters are awesome inventions, they have a very significant carbon footprint. It's estimated that aviation will be responsible for like 10% of the global carbon footprint by the middle of this century if nothing's done about it. So we have been very keen at United Therapeutics to develop the technologies to deliver our organs with a zero carbon footprint system. And we've been able to do this by backing Beta Technology in Vermont, which has a zero carbon footprint. I'll call it a helicopter. It's technically called an eVTOL, which is an acronym for electric vertical takeoff and landing. But in common parlance, it's a helicopter that runs electrically and has a zero carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So, I mean, it must have some sort of trade-off between the weight of a motor and the fuel in a traditional helicopter versus the weight of the battery in the vertical takeoff and landing. So is it all about making the batteries lighter, or what are kind of the main challenges?
Yeah, so it's a great question because it called for a lot of innovation and inventing. So there are basically two key things that were necessary to solve this problem. First of all, you had to have a very high density of energy per weight. And while this is achieved in regular aircraft and helicopters with Jet A fuel, or kind of gasoline, we would call it, with batteries, traditionally it was not possible. However, due to the tremendous runaway success of Tesla and the entire industry, there is actually nothing probably that has more money being invested in it right now than battery technology, because General Motors, Ford, Volvo, Mercedes, Porsche, Tesla, you name it, everybody is competing against each other to have the automobile that has the greatest range. And the way they get the greatest range is to have the highest, what's called watt hours per kilogram. Watt hour is the energy, kilogram is the weight. So when I started in this area, we were at 100 watt hours per kilogram. Already now we are at 350 watt hours per kilogram. And the experts are pretty confident that by the end of this decade, the 2020s, we will be at 1,000 watt hours per kilogram. At 1,000 watt hours per kilogram will be equivalent to Jet A fuel. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is whenever you're going through the air, you encounter resistance, which is called drag. So if you ever look on Google for which car has the lowest drag, you'll find it's the Tesla. And it's not by accident, of course. Elon Musk was, obsessive to reduce all the drag so he could have the best range for the Tesla cars for the given amount of battery technology. So I too have pushed our teams to have the lowest possible drag, to have the highest what we call lift to drag ratio, because the higher the lift to drag ratio, the farther we can go for any given amount of watt hours per kilogram in our energy source. So to give you just a bottom line number, average helicopter has a lift to drag ratio of 4. A simple airplane like, say, a Cessna 172, many people are familiar with, or a Piper, they have a lift to drag ratio of around 10 to 12. Our Alea aircraft, which, by the way, that's the middle name of our daughter Genesis, is Alea. Our Alea aircraft made by Beta, it has a lift to drag ratio of 18. So more than 4 times better than a helicopter. So it can go, even if it had just the same weight energy of a helicopter, it could go 4 times farther.
Fantastic. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to shift gears a little and just, tell you a little story and then connect the dots. So in 1964, Doug Engelbart, a scientist and engineer, built the prototype of what would become the computer mouse. And in it, he, of course, had this vision for how humans and computers would interface. And he then developed hypertext He demonstrated real-time collaboration on a document by people in 2 different locations. And, he's doing this in the mid to late 60s. And these are things we do every day now, but that took quite a few years. He also had a vision that humans and computers in the future would have totally other interfaces and, in fact, would connect in a form of transhumanism. And so I understand you also are working on and interested in this area. So I'm curious if you could articulate sort of your vision of transhumanism and, what's the future of the biological silicon interface, and maybe not so much on a technical level, but almost a philosophical level.
Sure. Well, we are definitely the descendants and the mind children of Doug's graphical user interface. Without his GUI, we'd still be in the Stone Age. And so I think the way to honor him is to continue to develop that technology and to create more and more of a graceful interface between our flesh bodies and our electronic tools and computational tools. We now would call that like a bioelectronic interface. We humans have been interfacing with our technology from time immemorial. The first humans that were able to domesticate fire were transhumans because they transcended their human limitation, which is that we'll shiver and we'll get cold, okay, when the temperature drops, by carrying with them and then nurturing fire to keep them warmer. Leap ahead to the Renaissance period, and we have eyeglasses. We humans have a limitation in our vision that, for most people, as we move on in years, our vision gets worse. Okay. And thank goodness that eyeglasses were developed, and thank goodness people like Benjamin Franklin developed bifocals. Glasses are the iconic transhuman technology. Because of eyeglasses, we humans are able to enjoy the world so much more. Because of glasses, if you're nearsighted, like say I am, you look out on a forest, and I love forests. Okay. When I'm not wearing glasses, the trees are like blurred, okay? But to get kind of spiritual here, the creator, God, nature, what have you, has given us beautiful forests and mountains. And when we wear this piece of transhuman technology, eyeglasses, we can appreciate creation so much more deeply. That's what Galileo said when he was challenged by the church in terms of, why are you using these telescopes to point out dark spots on the sun and, craters on the moon and, white dots going around Jupiter? And he said, why would the creator have created all of these things but for us to appreciate it? I mean, the logic is impeccable. It's the greatest logical response I think we have in our human history. Galileo is the iconic transhumanist. So now we've, compounded upon fire and steel and eyeglasses and the printing press and the, better machines. We've talked about electromagnetic communication, radio waves, digital communications, and here we are with computers and the graphical user interface and the kind of human machine interface that we have today. So I believe that as we merge ourselves with ever more sophisticated technology, we are not making ourselves in any way less human. I think we are making ourselves more human. And the better that we can merge with technology, for example, understanding all the information that's out there by being able to better merge with computers. How could have I found the cure for my daughter without information being out there? So the better we are able to merge with information, the better we will be able to appreciate, love, nurture, and enjoy the natural world as it is.
That's beautiful and fantastic. I do want to ask you just one final question. It's something I feel like we didn't give enough time to, but you talked about your transition to becoming a woman in the early 90s. And, at that time, it was maybe not as bad as it would have been 30, 40 years prior, but it certainly wasn't what it is today. But it remains something that's, a real challenge for some people who discover this piece of their identity and learn to act on it. You talked about how it unleashed creativity for you and really helped you. I just wonder, what would you say to a young person who's struggling with this?
I don't really feel that I'm qualified to answer that question because every person is different and every person's journey is unique. I am very grateful for the two psychologists that I work with. One of them was particularly amazing, Dr. Randy Etner in Chicago. She's written some books. I'm very grateful for people who came before me, like Kate Bornstein, who has also written a number of books. And each person is going to kind of have to find their own journey. In our local area, we share that we both live in Silver Spring, Maryland. We have an amazing congressman, and Jamie. And when Congressman Jamie Raskin, when his son unfortunately took his life recently, he shared with us at the memorial service a phrase that his son said, which is that it's difficult to be a human. And it is, I believe, very difficult to be a human. And so each of us has to find our own journey. We need help along the way. Sometimes, no matter how much help we provide, there are sad outcomes, as unfortunately happened in that case. But what we should do is to reach out to each other, to be nurturing and supportive, and try to give everybody the best possible outcome for their life. It is hard to be a human, but it's easier when we help each other.
Thank you so much, Martine. And what this evening's program has really shown is really the highest human achievement is to invent and to innovate, to bring new ideas to the benefit of others. You're a genuine inspiration, and so I applaud you. I wish the whole audience could, but I'll do it on their behalf. And really, thank you so much for being here tonight. And I want to thank the Lemelson team that's behind the scenes throughout this series, Emma Gran, Laura Havel, and a whole team that helps produce these. So thank everyone for attending. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, our updates, and to respond to a poll about the program. And we will be relaunching next spring for another series of innovative lives. Thank you, everyone.